In November 1943, the ancient city of Kiev stood as the ultimate prize on the Eastern Front. Known as the mother of Russian cities, this historic metropolis on the banks of the Dnieper River had endured 778 days of brutal Nazi occupation. Its liberation would mark a decisive turning point in World War II and demonstrate the unstoppable momentum of the Red Army's westward advance. Kiev's strategic importance extended far beyond its symbolic value. As Ukraine's capital and largest city, it controlled vital transportation networks connecting northern and southern sectors of the Eastern Front. The city's industrial capacity, though damaged by occupation, remained crucial to whoever controlled it. More importantly, Kiev's liberation would open the path to Poland and eventually Germany itself. The German occupation of Kiev had begun in September 1941 during the spectacular success of Operation Barbarossa. Wehrmacht forces, supported by Hungarian and Romanian allies, captured the city after one of the war's largest encirclement battles. Over 600,000 Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in what Hitler proclaimed as the greatest victory in military history. Under Nazi rule, Kiev became a center of terror and exploitation. The SS Einsatzgruppen conducted mass murders at Babi Yar, where over 33,000 Jews were killed in just 2 days. Ukrainian civilians faced starvation, forced labor deportation to Germany, and systematic destruction of their cultural heritage. The city's population, which had numbered 850,000 before the war, dwindled to fewer than 200,000 under occupation. By autumn 1943, the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. Following victories at Stalingrad and Kursk, Soviet forces had seized the initiative across the entire Eastern Front. The Red Army had successfully crossed the Dnieper River at multiple points, establishing bridgeheads that threatened German positions throughout Ukraine. Kiev, isolated and increasingly difficult to defend, became the focal point of Soviet liberation efforts. General Nikolai Vatutin commanded the First Ukrainian Front, the massive force assembled to liberate Kiev. His command included over 670,000 troops, supported by 7,000 artillery pieces, 2,400 tanks, and 2,500 aircraft. This overwhelming concentration of force represented the pinnacle of Soviet military power, accumulated through years of industrial mobilization and battlefield experience. German defenses around Kiev were formidable but increasingly strained. Army Group South, commanded by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, had constructed multiple defensive lines around the city. The 4th Panzer Army, led by General Hermann Hoff, held the immediate approaches to Kiev with a mixture of veteran Wehrmacht units and Hungarian auxiliaries. However, German forces were outnumbered nearly 3-1 and lacked adequate reserves. The German defensive strategy relied heavily on the natural obstacles provided by the Dnieper River and its tributaries. Extensive minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and carefully positioned artillery created killing zones designed to channel Soviet attacks into predetermined areas. German engineers had fortified key buildings throughout Kiev, transforming the city center into a fortress complex. Soviet planning for the Kiev offensive demonstrated the sophisticated military doctrine the Red Army had developed by late 1943. Rather than launch direct frontal assaults, Vatutin designed a complex deception operation that would mask the true direction of the main attack. The plan involved maintaining pressure on existing bridgeheads while secretly concentrating the assault force at an unexpected location. The key to Soviet success lay in establishing a new bridgehead north of Kiev near the village of Lyutezh. Soviet reconnaissance had identified this sector as weakly defended, held primarily by Hungarian units whose reliability was questionable. A successful crossing here would place Soviet forces just 25 kilometers from Kiev and threaten to encircle the entire German garrison. Preparations for the offensive required enormous logistical efforts conducted under strict secrecy. Soviet engineers stockpiled pontoon bridges, assault boats, and amphibious vehicles in forests along the Dnieper. Artillery units were positioned to provide devastating supporting fire, while tank corps prepared for rapid exploitation of any breakthrough achieved by infantry forces. The deception operation was elaborate and ultimately successful. Soviet forces maintained visible activity around existing bridgeheads, particularly at Bukryn south of Kiev, where dummy tanks and false radio traffic suggested preparations for a major offensive. Meanwhile, the real assault force moved into position north of the city under cover of darkness and strict camouflage discipline. On November 3, 1943, the Battle of Kiev began with a massive artillery bombardment that shattered the pre-dawn silence. Over 2,000 guns opened fire simultaneously, targeting German positions along the northern approaches to the city. The bombardment continued for 2 hours, systematically destroying defensive positions and severing communication lines between German units. Under cover of fog and artillery fire, assault troops of the 38th Army began crossing the Dnieper River at Lyutezh. Hungarian defenders, caught completely by surprise, offered minimal resistance as Soviet infantry established footholds on the western bank. Within hours, engineers had constructed pontoon bridges strong enough to support tanks and artillery. The crossing achieved complete tactical surprise. German commanders, focused on expected attacks from established bridgeheads, had positioned their reserves to counter threats from the south and east. The sudden appearance of Soviet forces north of Kiev created a dangerous gap in German defenses that could not be quickly closed. Soviet exploitation of the breakthrough was swift and devastating. The 3rd Guards Tank Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Pavel Rybalko, crossed the Dnieper and immediately advanced toward Kiev's northern suburbs. T-34 tanks, supported by motorized infantry and self-propelled artillery, overwhelmed scattered German resistance and pressed toward the city center. German response was hampered by confusion and the breakdown of communications. Field Marshal von Manstein recognized the threat immediately but lacked sufficient reserves to contain the Soviet breakthrough. The 24th Panzer Corps, Germany's primary mobile reserve, was committed piecemeal and could not achieve decisive results against overwhelming Soviet numbers. By November 5, Soviet forces had advanced to Kiev's outskirts and were engaging German defenders in the city's northern districts. The 60th Army joined the attack from the east, while elements of the 40th Army maintained pressure from established bridgeheads. German forces found themselves fighting on multiple fronts without adequate coordination or reserves. Street fighting erupted throughout Kiev as German forces attempted to hold key positions. The SS Viking Division, supported by Hungarian troops and German police units, established defensive positions in government buildings, railway stations, and major intersections. Every street corner became a battlefield as Soviet infantry cleared buildings room by room. Soviet urban warfare tactics had improved dramatically since the early war disasters at cities like Sevastopol and Stalingrad. Assault groups, typically consisting of infantry, engineers, and tank support, systematically cleared German strongpoints. Artillery and aviation provided precise fire support, while specialized units dealt with mines and booby traps left by retreating Germans. The fighting for Kyiv center was particularly intense around the ancient St. Sophia's Cathedral and the Kyiv Pechersk Lavra monastery complex. German forces used these historic buildings as observation posts and strongpoints, leading to damage to structures that had survived centuries of warfare. Soviet forces showed remarkable restraint in their use of heavy weapons near these cultural treasures. German resistance began crumbling on November 6 as Soviet forces penetrated deep into the city center. The Hungarian garrison, never fully committed to defending Kiev, began surrendering in large numbers. German units, isolated and running low on ammunition, fought desperate rearguard actions while attempting to escape westward. Lieutenant General Rybalko's tanks reached Kiev's main railway station on the morning of November 6, effectively cutting German escape routes and splitting the defending forces. Soviet infantry, following close behind the armor, began the systematic clearing of remaining German positions. Resistance collapsed as isolated German units surrendered or attempted to break out individually. At 4 a.m. on November 6, 1943, Soviet forces raised the red flag over Kiev City Hall, officially marking the liberation of Ukraine's capital. Radio Moscow announced the victory to the world, proclaiming that the mother of Russian cities had returned to Soviet hands after 778 days of Nazi occupation. Stalin personally congratulated the liberating forces and ordered nationwide celebrations. The human cost of Kiev's liberation reflected the intensity of the fighting and the importance both sides placed on the city. Soviet casualties totaled approximately 45,000 killed and wounded, while German and Hungarian losses exceeded 25,000. Civilian casualties were difficult to determine but certainly numbered in the thousands as the city changed hands amid fierce urban combat. The strategic consequences of Kiev's liberation were immediate and far-reaching. German Army Group South found its entire position in Ukraine compromised, forcing a general retreat toward the Polish border. The loss of Kiev opened Soviet access to western Ukraine and threatened to cut off German forces in the Crimea and southern Ukraine. For the Soviet Union, Kiev's liberation provided enormous psychological benefits that extended far beyond military considerations. The recapture of Ukraine's capital demonstrated the Red Army's offensive capabilities and marked the beginning of liberation operations that would continue until Berlin's fall. Soviet morale soared as news of the victory spread throughout the country. The victory also had significant implications for Soviet relations with Ukraine. Many Ukrainian civilians, who had initially welcomed German forces as liberators from Stalinist oppression, now witnessed the Red Army's return with mixed feelings. The battle marked the beginning of complex political struggles that would continue long after the war's end. International reaction to Kiev's liberation was overwhelmingly positive among the Allied powers. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill hailed the victory as proof of Soviet military prowess, while American observers noted the sophisticated planning and execution displayed by Red Army forces. The victory strengthened arguments for opening the Second Front in Western Europe. German propaganda attempted to minimize the significance of Kiev's loss, claiming that the city had been evacuated according to plan and that German forces remained capable of renewed offensive operations. However, neutral observers recognized that the loss of Kiev marked another step in Germany's inevitable retreat from conquered Soviet territory. Individual acts of heroism during the battle became legendary in Soviet military history. Senior Lieutenant Ivan Kudrya led his reconnaissance company in the first assault crossing at Lyutezh, personally eliminating German machine gun positions that threatened the bridgehead. Despite severe wounds, he continued fighting until evacuation became necessary. Captain Maria Borovichenko commanded an anti-aircraft battery that provided crucial support during the river crossing. Her guns, initially positioned to defend against Luftwaffe attacks, were lowered to engage German ground forces attempting to counterattack the bridgehead. Her unit's actions helped secure the crossing site during the critical first hours. Soviet engineering units performed remarkable feats during the battle, constructing bridges under fire and maintaining supply lines across the Dnieper. Major Alexei Petrov's engineer battalion built 3 separate bridges in 48 hours, allowing continuous reinforcement of forces fighting in Kiev. Their work under constant German artillery fire exemplified the dedication required for victory. The civilian population of Kiev faced enormous challenges during the liberation battle. Many residents, weakened by years of occupation and malnutrition, struggled to survive amid the urban combat. Soviet forces established evacuation routes for civilians while simultaneously conducting military operations, a complex task that required careful coordination. Ukrainian partisans operating behind German lines provided crucial intelligence and support during the offensive. Groups commanded by leaders like Sidor Kovpak had maintained contact with Soviet forces and provided detailed information about German defensive positions. Their activities also disrupted German retreat routes and captured valuable equipment. The technological aspects of the battle demonstrated the evolution of Soviet military capabilities. Improved radio communications allowed better coordination between different army groups, while new artillery techniques provided more effective fire support. Soviet aviation, now achieving air superiority, provided close support that proved decisive in urban combat. Medical services faced enormous challenges treating casualties from urban warfare. Soviet medical units, better prepared than in earlier battles, established aid stations throughout the city and maintained evacuation routes to hospitals on the eastern bank of the Dnieper. German medical personnel, many of them captured, provided assistance treating wounded from both sides. Post-liberation challenges in Kiev were enormous and required immediate Soviet attention. The city's infrastructure had been severely damaged during both the occupation and the liberation battle. Water systems, electrical networks, and transportation facilities needed urgent repair. Soviet authorities established emergency services to provide food, medical care, and shelter for surviving civilians who had endured nearly 3 years of Nazi rule. The political implications of Kiev's liberation extended throughout occupied Eastern Europe. Resistance movements in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the Baltic states drew inspiration from the Soviet victory, intensifying their activities against German occupation forces. German allies, particularly Hungary and Romania, began secretly exploring options for separate peace negotiations as the inevitability of German defeat became apparent. Soviet intelligence services immediately began operations in liberated Kiev to identify collaborators and establish security. The NKVD conducted extensive investigations into civilian behavior during the occupation, leading to arrests and deportations of suspected Nazi collaborators. These activities, while necessary for security, created tensions between Soviet authorities and Ukrainian civilians who had survived the occupation through various means. The reconstruction of Kiev became a showcase for Soviet organizational capabilities and determination to rebuild war-damaged territories. Within weeks of liberation, Soviet engineers had restored basic utilities and transportation links. The rapid restoration of normal life demonstrated the efficiency of Soviet administrative systems and provided a stark contrast to the destructive nature of German occupation policies. The Battle of Kiev marked a decisive moment in World War II, demonstrating Soviet military superiority and opening the path to complete liberation of Ukraine. The victory validated years of industrial mobilization and military reform while providing the momentum for continued advances toward Germany. Kiev's liberation became a symbol of inevitable Allied victory and the approaching end of Nazi domination in Eastern Europe.